The courthouse doors exploded open with a force that made every person in the packed Detroit Municipal Building freeze mid-conversation. Two bailiffs were dragging a black woman backwards through the doorway, her navy blazer twisted awkwardly as their hands gripped her arms. Her voice cut through the marble corridors like a knife. "You're making a mistake." The words echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing between the stone columns that lined the entrance hall. Within seconds, the quiet morning routine of the courthouse shattered into complete chaos. Camera phones came out of pockets and purses. Spectators rushed toward the commotion. Security guards reached for their radios, speaking urgently into their shoulder mics. The woman wasn't fighting violently, wasn't throwing punches or screaming obscenities. She was simply refusing to leave willingly, her voice steady and insistent as she repeated the same thing over and over. "I am Judge Ayanna Mitchell. You are making a catastrophic mistake." But nobody was listening. One of the bailiffs, a thick-necked man with a buzz cut, tightened his grip on her arm and muttered just loud enough for nearby witnesses to hear, "People like you need to learn their place in a courthouse." What nobody in that building knew, not the bailiffs with their hands on her arms, not the security guards converging on the scene, not the stunned crowd filming everything on their phones, was that they had just made an error so massive it would rip open a web of corruption reaching straight into the prosecutor's office. And it all started 3 hours earlier. Judge Harold Benson had called in sick from his home in Bloomfield Hills at 6:30 that morning. Bloomfield Hills, one of Detroit's wealthiest suburbs, where the lawns were maintained by professional landscapers and the driveways held luxury cars that cost more than most Detroit residents made in a year. Judge Benson was scheduled to preside over a high-profile case that morning, the preliminary hearing for Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old black contractor accused of embezzling $200,000 from the Wayne County School District. The case had been all over the local news for weeks. Headlines screamed about corruption in Detroit's struggling public school system. Editorial writers used Marcus Webb's name as shorthand for everything wrong with city contracts. Television reporters stood outside the courthouse doing live shots, framing Webb as the face of municipal betrayal. But there was something the public didn't know, something that only a handful of people in positions of power were aware of: Marcus Webb was innocent. And several of those people who knew the truth were actively working to make sure he went to prison anyway. When Judge Benson called in sick, the chief judge's office went into immediate scramble mode. They needed someone qualified, someone available, and they needed that person within the next 2 hours. The clerk made a series of rapid phone calls, working down a list of judges who might be able to step in on short notice. Most were already committed to other cases. Some were out of town. Finally, the clerk reached Dr. Ayanna Mitchell, a recently appointed visiting judge from the Michigan Court of Appeals. Dr. Mitchell had built a reputation over 15 years as one of the most brilliant legal minds in the state. She'd started her career as a civil rights attorney, the kind who took on cases nobody else wanted to touch. Police departments. Corrupt city officials. Corporations that thought they were untouchable. She'd won landmark cases that changed state law, cases that were now taught in law schools as examples of how one determined attorney could take on entire systems and win. 6 months ago, she'd been appointed to the appellate court, and this morning would be her first time presiding over a case in Detroit's municipal system. Dr. Ayanna Mitchell arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 in the morning, dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a cream silk blouse, carrying a leather briefcase that had been a gift from her mentor when she passed the bar exam 20 years earlier. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing Marcus Webb's case file at her kitchen table, making notes in the margins, highlighting passages that troubled her. Even on first examination, she'd noticed inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence, gaps in the timeline that didn't make sense, financial records that seemed too convenient, too perfectly damning. But she'd reserved judgment, knowing she'd need to hear the arguments in person before forming any conclusions. As she approached the main entrance of the courthouse, she felt the familiar mix of anticipation and responsibility that came with wearing the robe. She'd never taken for granted what it meant to sit on the bench, to hold someone's fate in her hands, to be the person who decided whether the system worked or failed. At the security desk just inside the entrance, a young officer looked up from his phone as she approached. His name tag read, Officer Kyle Brennan, and he had the look of someone who'd been working courthouse security for less than a year, still young enough to think the job was about following rules rather than understanding context. Dr. Mitchell placed her briefcase on the conveyor belt for the X-ray machine and stepped toward the metal detector. Officer Brennan held up a hand. ID badge, he asked, his tone carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone who spent all day checking credentials and had long since stopped seeing the people attached to them. Dr. Mitchell reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her judicial credentials, the official identification issued by the Michigan Court of Appeals. She held it out for him to examine. "I'm Judge Mitchell," she explained, her voice calm and professional. "I'm here to preside over the Webb case. I was called in this morning to substitute for Judge Benson." Officer Brennan barely glanced at the credentials in her hand. He frowned, his eyes moving from the ID to her face and back again, as if trying to reconcile something that didn't quite fit his expectations. He picked up the phone on his desk, punching in a number without explanation. Dr. Mitchell waited patiently, assuming this was standard protocol for visiting judges, some verification process she wasn't familiar with because she'd never worked in this particular courthouse before. Her briefcase emerged from the X-ray machine and she retrieved it, standing to the side while Officer Brennan spoke quietly into the phone. She checked the time on her phone. 8:35. The hearing was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock. She had 25 minutes to get to the courtroom, review any last-minute filings, and prepare herself mentally for what promised to be a contentious proceeding. What Dr. Mitchell didn't know, couldn't possibly have known, was that Officer Brennan wasn't calling a supervisor to verify her credentials. He was calling someone who had a very specific, very urgent interest in making sure she never made it to that courtroom. On the other end of the line was Assistant Prosecutor Dennis Crawford, a man who'd spent the last 3 years of his life building the case against Marcus Webb, brick by careful brick. Dennis Crawford had staked his entire political future on securing a conviction in this high-profile case. He had his eyes on running for district attorney in the next election cycle, and he needed this win. He needed to stand in front of cameras and talk about bringing corrupt contractors to justice. He needed newspaper editorials praising his tough stance on municipal corruption. He needed Marcus Webb behind bars, and he needed it to happen in a way that made Dennis Crawford look like the hero Detroit had been waiting for. When Dennis Crawford heard that Judge Benson, a judge he'd worked with many times over the years, a judge who'd always been quietly cooperative when it came to certain procedural matters, had been replaced by Dr. Ayanna Mitchell, he felt his stomach drop like he'd just stepped off a cliff. He knew exactly who Dr. Ayanna Mitchell was. He'd watched her dismantle prosecutorial misconduct in 3 separate cases during her time as a civil rights attorney. He'd seen her stand in front of appellate courts and methodically tear apart cases that prosecutors thought were airtight. He'd heard other prosecutors talk about her in the break room at legal conferences, the way soldiers might talk about an enemy sniper who never missed. If Dr. Ayanna Mitchell got into that courtroom and started asking questions, if she started pulling on the threads Crawford had so carefully woven together, the entire case could collapse. And if the case collapsed, so did his career. Crawford's voice was low and urgent when he spoke into the phone. "Don't let her in," he told Officer Brennan. "There's been a mix-up with the judge assignment. Keep her in the lobby until I can sort this out with the Chief Judge's office." He hung up before Brennan could ask questions, before there could be any record of a longer conversation, any transcript of what was really being ordered. Crawford sat back in his chair in the prosecutor's office 3 floors above the courtroom, his heart pounding, his mind already racing through contingency plans. He'd need to make more calls. He'd need to activate other people. He'd need to buy time, create confusion, throw sand in the gears until he could figure out how to get Judge Benson back on the case or find another judge who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions. Back in the lobby, Officer Brennan hung up the phone and turned to Dr. Mitchell with a newfound sense of authority, the kind that comes from believing you're following orders from someone important. "Ma'am, you're going to need to wait here. There's some confusion about the judge assignment." Dr. Mitchell looked at him carefully, trying to read what was happening behind his eyes. "There's no confusion," she said firmly, keeping her voice level but allowing a note of steel to enter it. "I received official notification from Chief Judge Williams at 7 o'clock this morning. The assignment is clear. I need to get to the courtroom." She held up her phone, showing him the email from the Chief Judge's office, the official communication that left no room for ambiguity. Officer Brennan didn't look at the phone. He stepped in front of her, physically positioning his body between Dr. Mitchell and the elevators that led to the courtrooms above. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside and wait." Dr. Mitchell felt it then, that familiar sensation that every black professional knows, that prickle of awareness that comes from being profiled, from being presumed guilty or out of place or somehow illegitimate simply because of the color of your skin. She'd experienced this hundreds of times throughout her career. She'd been mistaken for a defendant in courtrooms where she was the attorney. She'd been asked to show extra identification in buildings where white colleagues walked through with a smile and a wave. She'd been stopped by security in office buildings where she had meetings, questioned about where she was going and who she was there to see. But she never imagined, not in her most cynical moments, that she would experience this while holding judicial credentials, while wearing a blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, while carrying a briefcase full of legal documents that proved exactly who she was and why she was there. "Are you seriously telling me I can't access the courtroom?" Dr. Mitchell asked, and now there was no mistaking the edge in her voice, the controlled anger of someone who'd been patient for far too long. "I'm following orders, ma'am," Officer Brennan replied, and there was something in the way he said, "ma'am," that made it clear it wasn't a term of respect. Dr. Mitchell made a decision. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Chief Judge Williams in her contacts. She pressed call and held the phone to her ear. Chief Judge Williams answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the gruff warmth of someone who'd known her for years. "Judge Mitchell, is everything all right?" The fact that he asked that question immediately told her he could hear something in her voice, some tension that shouldn't be there on what should have been a routine morning. "I'm being prevented from entering the courthouse," Dr. Mitchell explained, choosing her words carefully, keeping her tone professional despite the anger building in her chest. "Security won't let me through." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of shocked silence, and then Chief Judge Williams's voice came back sharp and furious. "Put the officer on the phone. Right now." Dr. Mitchell held out the phone to Officer Brennan. "Chief Judge Williams would like to speak with you." Brennan's face showed the first flicker of uncertainty as he took the phone. He held it to his ear and Dr. Mitchell watched his expression change, watched him go pale as Chief Judge Williams's voice came through the speaker loud enough that she could hear it even though the phone wasn't on speaker mode. The words were sharp, angry, unequivocal. "That is Judge Mitchell. You will escort her to the courtroom immediately. Do you understand me?" Officer Brennan nodded even though Williams couldn't see him. "Yes, Your Honor. I apologize, Your Honor." He handed the phone back to Dr. Mitchell, his hand trembling slightly. "I apologize, Your Honor. Please follow me." But as Dr. Mitchell and Officer Brennan approached the elevator bank, two bailiffs emerged from a side corridor and moved quickly to intercept them. These were courthouse veterans, Officers Todd Jameson and Rick Peterman, both men who'd worked in the building for over a decade, both men who knew every judge by sight and every lawyer by name. But they'd received a different message this morning, one that had come through unofficial channels, a text from a number in the prosecutor's office that they'd been told to treat as priority communication. The message said a woman was impersonating a judge and attempting to disrupt the web hearing. The message said she was dangerous. The message said she needed to be removed from the building immediately. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," Officer Todd Jameson said, reaching for Dr. Mitchell's arm with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, someone who had no doubt whatsoever that he was doing the right thing. Dr. Mitchell pulled her arm back, stepping away from his reach. "I am Judge Ayanna Mitchell," she said, her voice rising now, no longer trying to stay calm, no longer willing to be patient with a system that refused to see her. "I am here to preside over a case in courtroom 4B. I have already spoken with Chief Judge Williams." She held up her phone as evidence, as proof, as something that should have ended this entire absurd situation right there. Officer Rick Peterman exchanged a glance with Officer Todd Jameson, a look that communicated volumes without words. Peterman had worked in this courthouse for 15 years and he'd never heard of a visiting appellate judge stepping in for a municipal case on a few hours' notice. It didn't make sense. The story didn't add up. And in his experience, when a story didn't add up, the person telling it was usually lying. "Ma'am, we're going to need to escort you out of the building," Officer Rick Peterman said, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who believed he was protecting the courthouse from a threat. Dr. Mitchell stood her ground, feet planted, briefcase gripped in her left hand. "Call Chief Judge Williams. Right now. I just spoke with him 30 seconds ago." But Officers Todd Jameson and Rick Peterman weren't interested in making phone calls. They had their orders. They had a woman who was causing a disruption, who was claiming to be someone she couldn't possibly be, who was refusing to leave when asked. In their minds, this was exactly the kind of situation they were trained to handle. Officer Todd Jameson grabbed Dr. Mitchell's left arm, his fingers closing around her bicep with enough force to ensure she couldn't easily pull away. Officer Rick Peterman grabbed her right arm, mirroring his partner's grip. And together, they began forcibly removing Dr. Ayanna Mitchell from the building, dragging her backwards toward the doors she'd walked through just 10 minutes earlier. That's when the cameras started recording. A reporter from the Detroit Free Press who'd been waiting in the lobby for the web hearing to begin saw what was happening and pulled out his phone, hitting record before his conscious mind had even fully processed what he was witnessing. Within seconds, other journalists noticed. Spectators in the lobby pulled out their phones. Court employees stopped what they were doing and stared. The footage showed Dr. Ayanna Mitchell, a distinguished black woman in professional attire, being physically dragged backwards through the courthouse doors while protesting her treatment. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't cursing. She wasn't doing anything that could be characterized as dangerous or threatening. She was simply refusing to leave willingly, asserting her rights, demanding that someone, anyone, verify her identity and acknowledge the mistake that was being made. Her voice carried through the lobby, clear and strong. "I am a sitting judge. You are assaulting a member of the judiciary. This is being recorded. You are all making a terrible mistake." The video started uploading to social media before Dr. Mitchell was even outside the building. Twitter first, then Facebook, then Instagram. A distinguished black woman in a navy blazer being forcibly removed from a courthouse by two white bailiffs. The optics were devastating. Within minutes, the video had hundreds of shares. Within 10 minutes, thousands. The comments section exploded with rage and disbelief. Local activists tagged civil rights organizations. Lawyers who knew Dr. Mitchell's reputation started making phone calls. News outlets picked up the story before their morning editorial meetings had even finished. And through it all, Assistant Prosecutor Dennis Crawford sat in his office 3 floors above, completely unaware that his desperate attempt to keep Dr. Mitchell out of the courtroom had just become the biggest story in Detroit. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Ayanna Mitchell stood on the concrete steps, still holding her briefcase, her credentials still in her pocket, her phone buzzing with incoming messages that she couldn't check because her hands were shaking with a rage so pure it felt like electricity running through her veins. Officers Todd Jameson and Rick Peterman had released her the moment they'd gotten her through the doors, stepping back quickly as if they'd just realized they'd touched something dangerous. They stood there now, blocking the entrance, their faces showing the first hints of uncertainty, the first cracks in their absolute conviction that they'd done the right thing. Dr. Mitchell took a breath, forcing herself to think clearly despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She'd been a civil rights attorney long enough to know that moments like this, moments of injustice so blatant they seemed almost theatrical, were also moments of opportunity. Everything that had just happened was on camera. Every word spoken, every hand placed on her arm, every step of her forced removal had been documented by a dozen phones. She needed to stay calm. She needed to let the evidence speak for itself. Meanwhile, inside courtroom 4B, Assistant Prosecutor Dennis Crawford stood at the prosecution table, checking his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. 9:05. The hearing was supposed to have started 5 minutes ago, and there was still no judge on the bench. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, a thin man in his mid-30s wearing a suit that looked like it might have been borrowed for the occasion, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who'd learned not to show emotion in courtrooms because any emotion could be used against you. Next to him sat his attorney, Jasmine Torres, a 28-year-old public defender who'd been assigned to the case only 3 weeks earlier when Marcus's previous attorney had withdrawn, citing a conflict of interest that had never been fully explained. Jasmine Torres had immediately recognized the problems with the prosecution's case. The financial records didn't match. The timeline had gaps. Key witnesses had given contradictory statements. But she lacked the resources and the experience to fight someone like Dennis Crawford, a prosecutor who'd been working high-profile cases since before she'd graduated from law school. Crawford's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and felt his heart rate spike. The text was from a paralegal in his office: "Judge Mitchell removed from building. Video everywhere. Chief Judge Williams is furious." Crawford's mouth went dry. He'd wanted to delay the hearing, wanted to create enough confusion to buy himself time to figure out his next move. But he hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't thought about cameras, about witnesses, about the fact that physically removing a black woman from a courthouse in Detroit in the year 2025 was going to look exactly as bad as it actually was. His phone buzzed again. Another text, this one from a colleague: "What did you do?" Crawford felt the courtroom walls closing in on him. He'd made a catastrophic miscalculation, and he knew it. But there was no time to process that now, no time to figure out damage control, because the doors at the back of the courtroom were opening and Chief Judge Williams himself was striding through them. Chief Judge Williams was a tall man in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered and imposing even in his regular business suit rather than judicial robes. He rarely left his chambers for anything less than a genuine crisis, and his presence in a courtroom where he wasn't scheduled to preside meant something had gone very, very wrong. The bailiff stationed in the courtroom started to call out, "All rise," but Williams waved him off impatiently. He walked straight to the bench, not sitting, just standing there looking out at the assembled lawyers and spectators with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Where is Judge Mitchell?" Chief Judge Williams demanded, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. Dennis Crawford felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He cleared his throat, buying himself seconds he desperately needed to formulate some kind of response. "Your Honor, I understood there was a security issue this morning. I was told that." "You understood?" Chief Judge Williams's voice rose, cutting through Crawford's explanation like a chainsaw through paper. "You understood that a sitting appellate court judge was being physically removed from this building based on false information that originated from your office?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters who'd been waiting for the hearing to begin suddenly had a much bigger story. They scribbled in their notebooks, typed frantically on their phones, recorded every word on their audio devices. Jasmine Torres leaned over to Marcus Webb and whispered, "Something's happening. Something big." Marcus Webb didn't respond, didn't dare to hope, because hope was dangerous when you'd watched the system systematically dismantle your life for the past 18 months. Chief Judge Williams turned to the bailiff stationed in the courtroom, the one who hadn't been involved in the lobby incident, the one who was now looking thoroughly confused about what he'd walked into. "Find Judge Mitchell immediately and escort her here with full apologies. And get me Officers Jameson and Peterman. I want them in my chambers in 15 minutes. The bailiff nodded and rushed out of the courtroom. Dennis Crawford wanted to say something, wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that it had all been a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a series of unfortunate errors. But he could see in Chief Judge Williams's face that no explanation was going to be sufficient. The damage was done. All that remained was to find out exactly how bad it was going to get. Chief Judge Williams looked at Crawford for a long moment, a look that communicated more than words ever could. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a silence so thick you could have cut it with a knife. But Dr. Ayanna Mitchell was already on her way back. After being released outside the courthouse, still holding her briefcase and her credentials, still processing the shock and anger of what had just happened, she'd been approached by a senior courthouse administrator named Patricia Chen. Patricia had been working in the building for 23 years and she'd seen the viral video approximately 90 seconds after it started spreading, because her daughter had texted it to her with the message, "Mom, is this at your courthouse?" Patricia had immediately recognized Dr. Mitchell from the judicial training seminar they'd both attended 6 months earlier. She'd run out of her office and down to the main entrance, where she'd found Dr. Mitchell standing on the steps, surrounded by cameras and questions she wasn't answering. "Judge Mitchell," Patricia had said, slightly out of breath from running. "I am so deeply sorry. Please, let me escort you back inside. There's a private entrance that will take you directly to the courtroom level." Dr. Mitchell had looked at Patricia Chen and seen genuine horror and remorse in her face, the reaction of someone who understood exactly how wrong this was and wanted desperately to make it right. "The bailiff said I was impersonating a judge," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "They had orders to remove me from the building." Patricia Chen's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Those orders couldn't have come from anyone with legitimate authority. Judge Mitchell, please, let me take you to the courtroom. Chief Judge Williams is furious. The prosecutor's office is about to have a very bad day." That last sentence, delivered with a grim satisfaction, had been enough to convince Dr. Mitchell to follow Patricia back into the building. Not through the main entrance where Officers Jameson and Peterman were still standing, looking increasingly uncertain about their futures, but through a side door that led to a private elevator used primarily by judges and senior court staff. As the elevator rose toward the 4th floor, Patricia Chen kept apologizing, kept saying she couldn't understand how this had happened, kept promising that there would be accountability. Dr. Mitchell barely heard her. She was thinking about Marcus Webb, about the case file she'd reviewed the night before, about the inconsistencies that had troubled her. She was thinking about the desperate measures someone had taken to keep her out of that courtroom. And she was starting to form a theory, a suspicion that was going to require very careful investigation, but that was already crystallizing into certainty. Someone didn't want her presiding over this case. Someone had been willing to risk an enormous scandal to prevent her from taking that bench. Which meant there was something in that case file, something in the evidence or the testimony or the procedural history, that couldn't survive her scrutiny. The elevator doors opened and Patricia Chen led her down a corridor to the chambers adjacent to courtroom 4B. Dr. Mitchell took a moment in the empty chambers to compose herself. She looked at her reflection in a small mirror on the wall and saw that her navy blazer was wrinkled from where the bailiffs had grabbed her arms, saw that her hair had come slightly loose from the neat style she'd worn it in that morning, saw the anger still burning in her eyes. She took several deep breaths, smoothed down her blazer as much as possible, adjusted her hair, and transformed her face into the calm, controlled expression she wore on the bench. She picked up her briefcase, walked to the door that led directly into the courtroom, and pushed it open. The entire room fell silent. Every person in that courtroom, from the court reporter to the spectators in the gallery, turned to look at her. Dr. Mitchell walked to the bench with measured steps, her head high, her bearing dignified despite everything that had just happened to her. The bailiff who'd been sent to find her had returned and now called out, "All rise," though most people were already standing, frozen in shock at what they were witnessing. Dr. Mitchell took her seat at the bench and spent a long moment looking out at the courtroom. Her eyes moved from face to face, reading the room, understanding who knew what had happened and who was still trying to figure it out. Her gaze settled on Dennis Crawford, who stood at the prosecution table looking like a man who'd just watched his entire life collapse in real time. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked down at the papers in front of him, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. Dr. Mitchell let the silence stretch out, let the tension build, let everyone in that room understand that something unprecedented was happening. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Mr. Crawford, would you like to explain to this court why a sitting judge was forcibly removed from this building this morning?" Dennis Crawford's mouth opened but no sound came out. He swallowed, tried again. "Your Honor, there was a miscommunication between courthouse security and..." Dr. Mitchell cut him off, her voice sharp now, precise as a scalpel. "A miscommunication that happened to occur right before I was scheduled to hear a case you're prosecuting? A miscommunication that resulted in courthouse security receiving false information about my credentials? A miscommunication that led to me being physically dragged out of this building while cameras recorded the entire incident?" Crawford stammered, "Your Honor, I can assure you that I had no intention of..." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "What were your intentions, Mr. Crawford? Because from where I'm sitting, it appears that someone in your office made multiple calls to courthouse personnel this morning, providing them with information designed to prevent me from reaching this courtroom. Would you like to tell me why that might have happened?" The courtroom had gone completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Reporters were recording every word, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be taught in journalism schools and law schools for years to come. Jasmine Torres felt her heart pounding in her chest, felt a surge of hope that she'd been trying to suppress for weeks. Marcus Webb sat perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid that if he moved or spoke he might break whatever spell was protecting him in this moment. Dennis Crawford looked around the courtroom as if searching for someone who might save him, but there was no one. He was alone at the prosecution table, facing a judge who'd built her career destroying men like him, and he could feel the walls closing in. Dr. Mitchell reached for the gavel and tapped it once, a sound that seemed to echo through the courthouse. "This hearing is postponed pending an immediate investigation into the events of this morning. Mr. Crawford, I am ordering the immediate preservation of all communications between your office and courthouse security, including phone records, emails, text messages, and any other correspondence that occurred between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. today. I am also requesting that the State Bar Association open an inquiry into potential prosecutorial misconduct in this matter." Crawford's face went from white to gray. His career, his political ambitions, his carefully constructed future, all of it was crumbling in real time. Dr. Mitchell wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I will be reviewing the entire case file for the People vs. Marcus Webb. I noticed certain irregularities in my preliminary review last night, and given the extraordinary measures taken to prevent me from presiding over this hearing, I believe a more thorough examination is warranted." That last sentence hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Dennis Crawford understood exactly what she was saying. She'd found something. Or she suspected something. And now she was going to tear apart every document, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, looking for the truth he'd worked so hard to bury. He wanted to object, wanted to argue that she was biased now, that the morning's events had compromised her ability to preside fairly. But he knew that argument would go nowhere. If anything, he'd be the one accused of bias, of corruption, of attempting to manipulate the judicial process for his own benefit. Dr. Mitchell looked at Marcus Webb for the first time. "Mr. Webb, I apologize that you've had to wait for justice while these irregularities are addressed. This court will move as quickly as possible to resolve your case fairly and thoroughly." Marcus Webb nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Dr. Mitchell turned to Jasmine Torres. "Ms. Torres, please be prepared to present any concerns you have about the prosecution's evidence when we reconvene. I want a complete record." Dr. Mitchell tapped the gavel again. "This hearing is adjourned. We will reconvene at a date to be determined once the investigation into this morning's events is complete. Court is dismissed." The bailiff called out, "All rise," and everyone stood as Dr. Mitchell stepped down from the bench and walked back through the door to the chambers. The moment she was gone, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Lawyers crowded around Jasmine Torres, offering advice and support. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, his head in his hands, finally allowing himself to feel the emotions he'd been suppressing for months. And Dennis Crawford stood alone at the prosecution table, his phone already buzzing with calls from his supervisors, from the media, from everyone who'd just watched his career implode on live television and social media. He'd tried to keep Dr. Ayanna Mitchell out of the courtroom because he knew she'd find the truth. And in trying to stop her, he'd guaranteed that the whole world would be watching when she did. Within hours of the courtroom adjournment, investigators from the Michigan State Bar Association arrived at the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office with subpoenas and briefcases full of documentation tools. They weren't coming to ask polite questions. They were coming to dismantle whatever web of misconduct had led to a sitting judge being physically removed from a courthouse, and they had the authority to seize records, interview staff, and freeze any documents that might be relevant to their inquiry. Dennis Crawford sat in a windowless conference room on the third floor, watching his carefully constructed world collapse piece by piece. His phone had been confiscated. His computer was being imaged by forensic specialists. His emails were being read by attorneys who specialized in prosecutorial ethics violations. And every 15 minutes, someone new came into the conference room to ask him the same questions in slightly different ways, looking for inconsistencies, searching for the moment when his story would crack open and reveal the truth underneath. The investigation moved with a speed that shocked even veteran courthouse observers. Chief Judge Williams had personally called the State Bar Association president at 9:30 that morning, immediately after leaving courtroom 4B, and had used words like corruption, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violation in a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes but carried the weight of a judicial career spent building credibility and relationships. When Chief Judge Williams made a call like that, people listened. When Chief Judge Williams said a case needed immediate attention, investigators cleared their schedules and mobilized resources. By 10 a.m., a team of 3 senior investigators was driving from Lansing to Detroit. By 11 a.m., they were sitting in the prosecutor's office, demanding access to everything related to the Marcus Webb case and the events of that morning. By noon, they'd uncovered the phone records that showed Dennis Crawford had made 4 separate calls to courthouse security between 7:15 and 8:45 a.m. The phone records were damning on their own, but it was the content of those calls that transformed this from a potential misunderstanding into clear evidence of intentional obstruction. Officer Kyle Brennan, the young security officer who'd first stopped Dr. Mitchell at the entrance, had been interviewed by courthouse administration within an hour of the incident. He'd been terrified, understanding that his career was probably over, and he'd been completely honest about what had happened. He told investigators that Dennis Crawford had called him directly and had described a suspicious individual who would be attempting to access courtroom 4B. Crawford had said the individual would likely claim to be a judge but was actually someone trying to disrupt the Webb hearing. Crawford had specifically mentioned that the individual was a black woman in her 40s wearing professional attire. He'd told Brennan to keep her in the lobby and to call him immediately if she showed up. When pressed by investigators, Brennan admitted that Crawford had never used the words, "Don't let her in," but the implication had been crystal clear. The message had been, "This person is a threat, this person should not reach the courtroom, you need to stop her." Officers Todd Jameson and Rick Peterman had received a similar message, but theirs had come through a different channel. A junior prosecutor in Crawford's office, a 26-year-old named Kevin Martinez who'd been with the office for less than a year, had sent them a text message at 8:20 a.m. The message had read, "Woman impersonating judge trying to access Webb hearing. Dennis says remove her from building immediately." When questioned, Kevin Martinez had broken down almost immediately. He'd explained that Crawford had been pacing his office that morning, making calls, looking increasingly frantic. Crawford had asked Martinez to handle the security situation and had given him specific instructions to contact the bailiffs and tell them there was someone impersonating a judge. Martinez claimed he'd thought it was legitimate, that Crawford had information from some other source, that he was just following orders from a senior prosecutor. But even as he said it, Martinez understood how weak it sounded, how obvious it was that he'd participated in something fundamentally wrong. By 2 p.m., the investigators had enough evidence to present a preliminary report to Chief Judge Williams and the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. The phone records, the witness statements, the text messages, all of it pointed to a coordinated effort by Dennis Crawford to prevent Dr. Ayanna Mitchell from reaching courtroom 4B. But what the investigators didn't yet understand was why. Why would an assistant prosecutor risk his entire career to keep a judge out of a courtroom? What was so dangerous about Dr. Mitchell presiding over the Webb hearing that Crawford had been willing to commit what amounted to judicial obstruction? The answer to that question was sitting in Dr. Mitchell's temporary chambers, where she'd spent the past 3 hours conducting her own investigation into the Marcus Webb case file. Dr. Mitchell had requested the complete discovery file from the court clerk, not just the sanitized version that had been submitted for the preliminary hearing, but everything. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence that had been collected during the 18-month investigation into Marcus Webb. The file filled 4 bankers' boxes, and Dr. Mitchell had gone through it with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent 20 years finding needles in legal haystacks. She'd started with the financial records, the bank statements and wire transfer receipts that supposedly proved Marcus Webb had embezzled $200,000 from the Wayne County School District. The prosecution's theory was simple: Webb had submitted invoices for construction work that was never completed, had received payments from the school district, and had deposited those payments into his personal accounts. The bank statements submitted as evidence showed deposits totaling exactly $200,000 over a 6-month period, deposits that corresponded to the dates of the fraudulent invoices. But Dr. Mitchell had noticed something in her preliminary review the night before, and now, with access to the complete file, she could see it clearly. The bank statements in the prosecution's evidence packet didn't match the original bank statements in the discovery materials. Someone had altered them. The changes were subtle, the kind of thing most people would never notice, but Dr. Mitchell had reviewed thousands of financial documents in her career as a civil rights attorney, and she knew what authentic bank records looked like. The fonts were slightly different. The formatting was inconsistent. Most tellingly, the dates on several transactions had been changed by a day or two, just enough to make them align with the fraudulent invoice dates. Dr. Mitchell pulled out her phone and called Patricia Chen, the courthouse administrator who'd escorted her back into the building. "Patricia, I need you to get me the original discovery file from the Marcus Webb case. Not copies. The originals that were submitted to the court 18 months ago." Patricia Chen understood immediately. "You think something was changed?" Dr. Mitchell kept her voice neutral. "I think we need to verify the chain of custody for certain documents. Can you have those originals brought to my chambers within the hour?" Patricia promised she would make it happen, and Dr. Mitchell hung up. She turned back to the file and continued her review, this time focusing on the witness statements. The school district superintendent, a man named Robert Kellerman, had given a statement saying he'd never authorized payments to Marcus Webb, that the invoices were fraudulent, that Webb had exploited a gap in the district's oversight procedures. But buried in the discovery materials, in a section that had been marked as irrelevant administrative documents, Dr. Mitchell found something that contradicted Kellerman's statement. She found an email chain from 14 months ago, before Webb had been charged, in which Kellerman explicitly approved payment to Webb's construction company for renovation work at 3 different school buildings. The emails were detailed and specific. Kellerman had written, "Marcus Webb's company has done excellent work on the Jefferson Elementary renovation. I'm authorizing payment of $68,000 for completed work and approving his bid for the Lincoln Middle School project." There were similar emails for 2 other projects, each one showing Kellerman personally approving both the work and the payments. The emails totaled $197,000, almost exactly the amount Webb was accused of embezzling. Dr. Mitchell sat back in her chair, feeling a cold certainty settle in her chest. Marcus Webb hadn't embezzled anything. He'd done legitimate construction work, had been paid for that work by a school district superintendent who'd approved every invoice, and then, for reasons she didn't yet understand, that same superintendent had claimed the payments were fraudulent and the work was never completed. Someone had altered the bank statements to make it look like Webb had stolen the money. Someone had buried the emails that proved Kellerman had authorized the payments. And someone had built an entire criminal case on evidence that was, at best, misleading and, at worst, completely fabricated. Dr. Mitchell's phone buzzed. It was a text from Chief Judge Williams. "State Bar investigators want to brief you on their findings. Can you meet in my chambers at 3 p.m.? Dr. Mitchell texted back, "I'll be there. I have findings of my own to share." At 3 p.m., Dr. Mitchell walked into Chief Judge Williams's chambers carrying one of the banker's boxes from the Marcus Webb file. The room was crowded with people: Chief Judge Williams, 3 State Bar investigators, the Wayne County District Attorney himself, and a representative from the Michigan Attorney General's office. Everyone stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that felt both appropriate and slightly awkward given what had happened that morning. Dr. Mitchell set the box on Williams's conference table and looked around the room. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. What happened to me this morning was wrong, but it's not the biggest problem we're facing. The biggest problem is that an innocent man has been sitting in legal limbo for 18 months while prosecutors built a case against him using falsified evidence." The room went completely silent. The Wayne County District Attorney, a man named Thomas Brennan who'd held the position for 6 years and had political ambitions that reached all the way to the governor's mansion, looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Judge Mitchell, that's an extremely serious allegation." Dr. Mitchell opened the banker's box and pulled out 2 sets of documents. "These are bank statements from Marcus Webb's account. This set was submitted as evidence by the prosecutor's office. This set is from the original discovery materials provided by Webb's bank. They don't match." She laid them side by side on the conference table, pointing out the differences in formatting, the altered dates, the inconsistencies that proved someone had edited the documents. The investigators crowded around, examining the papers with increasing alarm. Dr. Mitchell continued. I also found emails in the discovery file that directly contradict the superintendent's testimony. Robert Kellerman claimed he never authorized payments to Marcus Webb. But I have emails where Kellerman personally approved those exact payments, praised Webb's work, and authorized additional projects. One of the State Bar investigators, a woman named Sarah Hendricks who'd been doing this work for 15 years, looked up from the documents with an expression of controlled fury. This isn't just prosecutorial misconduct. This is evidence tampering. This is potentially conspiracy to commit fraud. If what you're showing us is accurate, Mr. Crawford didn't just obstruct your access to the courtroom this morning. He's been running a corrupt prosecution for over a year. Thomas Brennan, the district attorney, had gone pale. He understood exactly what this meant for his office, for his reputation, for his political future. I need to see everything, he said quietly. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence. If there's been corruption in my office, I need to know the full extent of it. Dr. Mitchell looked at him carefully, trying to assess whether this was genuine concern or political calculation. She decided it didn't matter. Either way, the investigation would move forward. Over the next 2 hours, the group went through the Marcus Webb file piece by piece. They compared the altered bank statements to the originals. They read the email chains that proved Kellerman had authorized the payments. They reviewed the timeline of events and noticed that the criminal investigation had begun exactly 2 weeks after Kellerman had been passed over for a promotion to the State Education Board, a position he desperately wanted and had lobbied for aggressively. They found a series of phone calls between Kellerman and Dennis Crawford that started immediately after Kellerman lost the promotion, calls that lasted 15, 20, 30 minutes, calls that happened late at night and on weekends. And they began to construct a theory of what had actually happened. Robert Kellerman, angry about being passed over for promotion and looking for someone to blame, had decided to claim that money paid to Marcus Webb had been embezzled. Crawford, desperate for a high-profile win and perhaps not looking too closely at the evidence, had built a case based on Kellerman's false accusations. And when inconsistencies started appearing, when defense attorneys started asking questions, Crawford had doubled down, altering evidence and burying documents rather than admitting the case was weak. By 5 p.m., the decision had been made. The Wayne County District Attorney's Office would file a motion to dismiss all charges against Marcus Webb. Dennis Crawford would be suspended immediately pending criminal investigation. Kevin Martinez, the junior prosecutor who'd sent the text message to the bailiffs, would be placed on administrative leave. And the Attorney General's office would open a formal investigation into potential criminal charges against both Crawford and Kellerman. Sarah Hendricks, the State Bar investigator, looked at Dr. Mitchell with something like awe. You found all of this in 3 hours? Dr. Mitchell shook her head. I found most of it last night when I reviewed the file at home. I saw the inconsistencies then, but I needed access to the complete discovery to prove it. That's why Crawford was so desperate to keep me out of that courtroom. He knew I'd find the truth. Chief Judge Williams leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted. If you hadn't been assigned to this case, if Judge Benson hadn't called in sick, Marcus Webb would probably be in prison right now. Dr. Mitchell didn't respond to that. She was thinking about all the other Marcus Webbs, all the other innocent people who didn't get lucky, who didn't have a civil rights attorney turned appellate judge reviewing their files, who ended up convicted because nobody looked closely enough at the evidence. The motion to dismiss all charges against Marcus Webb was filed at 9 a.m. the following morning, exactly 24 hours after Dr. Ayanna Mitchell had been dragged out of the courthouse. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, members of Marcus Webb's family who'd driven in from across Michigan, and dozens of Detroit residents who'd seen the viral video and wanted to witness what happened next. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table wearing the same borrowed suit, but this time his expression was different. There was hope in his eyes now, cautious and fragile, but real. Jasmine Torres sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she organized her files, still barely believing what had happened in the past 24 hours. She'd been a public defender for 3 years and she'd never seen a case reverse course this dramatically, this quickly. She'd never seen prosecutors scramble to undo their own work, never seen a district attorney stand in front of cameras and admit his office had gotten it catastrophically wrong. Dr. Mitchell took the bench at 9:15, and the room fell into immediate silence. She looked out at the packed gallery, at the cameras positioned in the back row, at the faces of people who'd come to see justice done or justice denied. She picked up the motion to dismiss and read through it one more time, even though she'd already reviewed it twice that morning. The language was careful, legalistic, designed to protect the prosecutor's office from liability while acknowledging that significant irregularities in the evidence made it impossible to proceed with the case. It didn't say what everyone in that courtroom knew, that Marcus Webb had been framed, that evidence had been fabricated, that an innocent man had spent 18 months fighting charges that should never have been filed. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Dr. Mitchell looked at Marcus Webb. "Mr. Webb, please stand." Marcus stood, his legs unsteady, Jasmine Torres rising beside him in a gesture of solidarity. Dr. Mitchell's voice was clear and formal. "The state of Michigan has filed a motion to dismiss all charges against you. The court has reviewed this motion and finds that dismissal is warranted given the significant irregularities that have come to light in the prosecution's evidence. The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled. You are free to go, Mr. Webb." For a moment, Marcus Webb didn't move. He stood there, swaying slightly, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. Then his knees buckled and he sat down hard in his chair, his head falling into his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been holding back for 18 months. Jasmine Torres put her hand on his shoulder, her own eyes filling with tears. The gallery erupted in applause, people standing and cheering despite the bailiff's attempts to maintain courtroom decorum. Dr. Mitchell didn't stop them. She let the moment happen, let Marcus Webb have his release, let the people who'd come to support him celebrate this small victory against a system that had tried to destroy him. When the noise finally subsided, Dr. Mitchell continued. "I want to address what happened in this case, because it matters beyond Mr. Webb's individual circumstances. This court has reviewed extensive evidence suggesting that financial records were altered, that exculpatory emails were buried in discovery, and that false testimony was presented to support charges that had no legitimate basis. These are not minor procedural errors. These are fundamental violations of prosecutorial ethics and potentially criminal acts. The State Bar Association and the Michigan Attorney General's Office are conducting investigations into these matters, and this court expects full cooperation from all parties involved." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Mr. Webb, you have suffered an enormous injustice. You have lost time, money, reputation, and peace of mind because people in positions of power either failed to do their jobs properly or actively worked to convict you despite evidence of your innocence. On behalf of this court, I apologize for what the system has put you through." Marcus Webb looked up at her, tears streaming down his face, and nodded. He couldn't speak. He didn't trust his voice. But the look he gave her communicated everything: gratitude, relief, vindication, and a bone-deep exhaustion from fighting a battle he'd never asked to be part of. Dr. Mitchell turned her attention to the prosecution table, where a senior assistant district attorney named Rebecca Chow stood alone. Dennis Crawford was notably absent, already suspended and facing his own legal jeopardy. Rebecca Chow was a 20-year veteran of the office who'd been brought in to handle the motion to dismiss because she had a reputation for integrity and had no connection to the Webb case. She looked profoundly uncomfortable, standing there representing an office that had just been exposed for corruption. Dr. Mitchell's voice was harder now, carrying an edge of anger that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Chow, I want you to take a message back to the district attorney. This court expects a full accounting of how this case was handled from the beginning. I want to know who altered those bank statements. I want to know who made the decision to bury the emails that proved Mr. Kellerman had authorized the payments. I want to know every person who touched this case and what they knew." Rebecca Chow nodded. "Your Honor, the district attorney has already initiated an internal review. We are cooperating fully with the State Bar investigation and the Attorney General's inquiry. I can assure you," Dr. Mitchell cut her off. "I don't want assurances, Ms. Chow. I want accountability. Because if this happened to Marcus Webb, if prosecutors in your office were willing to fabricate evidence and obstruct justice in this case, how many other cases are tainted? How many other innocent people are sitting in jail right now because nobody looked closely enough at the evidence?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Rebecca Chow looked down at the prosecution table, her face flushed with shame for an office she'd served loyally for 2 decades. Dr. Mitchell tapped her gavel. "This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned." As people filed out of the courtroom, reporters rushed to surround Marcus Webb and Jasmine Torres, shouting questions about how he felt, what he planned to do next, whether he would sue. Marcus couldn't answer. He was still crying, still processing, still trying to believe that it was really over. Outside the courthouse, a very different scene was unfolding. Dennis Crawford had arrived at the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office at 8 a.m., summoned for what he'd been told was a mandatory meeting with District Attorney Thomas Brennan. He'd spent the previous evening at home, ignoring calls from reporters and colleagues, drinking bourbon and trying to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. He'd considered resigning, considered fleeing the state, considered a dozen different strategies before settling on defiance. He would deny everything. He would claim he'd been trying to protect the integrity of the case, that any communications with courthouse security had been misunderstood, that the altered evidence was the result of administrative errors he'd known nothing about. It was a weak strategy, full of holes, but it was all he had left. When he walked into Brennan's office, he found not just the district attorney but 2 investigators from the Attorney General's office and a representative from the Michigan State Police. Thomas Brennan didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dennis, you're being placed on immediate administrative suspension without pay. You are required to surrender your badge, your office keys, and any case files in your possession. You are not to contact any current or former employees of this office, any judges, or any witnesses in any case you've prosecuted. Do you understand?" Crawford felt the room tilt. "Tom, you can't just," Brennan's voice was ice. "I can and I am. The evidence against you is overwhelming, Dennis. The phone records, the witness statements, the text messages you had Kevin Martinez send. We have proof that you orchestrated the removal of Judge Mitchell from the courthouse. We have proof that you knew about the altered bank statements in the Webb case. And we're just getting started. The investigators are going through every case you've touched in the past 5 years." One of the Attorney General's investigators, a stern-faced woman named Detective Laura Simmons, stepped forward. "Mr. Crawford, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Crawford's mind went blank. They were arresting him. This wasn't just administrative discipline or professional consequences. This was criminal prosecution. He thought about his political ambitions, about the district attorney campaign he'd been planning, about the future he'd built in his imagination. All of it was gone, burned to ash in less than 48 hours. "I want a lawyer," he said quietly. Detective Simmons nodded. "That's probably the smartest thing you've said this week. You're not under arrest yet, but I'd advise you to retain counsel immediately. We'll be filing charges within the next 72 hours. Crawford left the building through a side exit, trying to avoid the reporters who'd already gathered in the lobby. But someone had tipped them off, and cameras were waiting when he emerged onto the street. Questions came at him from every direction. "Mr. Crawford, did you order security to remove Judge Mitchell? Did you fabricate evidence in the Marcus Webb case? How many other cases are tainted by prosecutorial misconduct?" Crawford pushed through the crowd without answering, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. By that afternoon, the story had expanded beyond Detroit, beyond Michigan, becoming a national conversation about racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and systemic failures in the criminal justice system. Cable news channels ran segments with legal experts analyzing what had gone wrong. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding comprehensive reviews of cases handled by Dennis Crawford. The video of Dr. Mitchell being dragged from the courthouse had been viewed millions of times, shared by celebrities and politicians, held up as evidence of how black professionals were treated even when they held positions of authority and respect. Marcus Webb's attorney, Jasmine Torres, found herself in demand for interviews, her phone ringing constantly with requests from national media outlets. She gave several interviews that evening, her message consistent: this wasn't just about one case or one corrupt prosecutor, this was about a system that was willing to destroy innocent people in pursuit of convictions and political advancement. Robert Kellerman, the school district superintendent who'd made the initial false accusations against Marcus Webb, was also facing consequences. The school board had placed him on immediate leave and hired outside investigators to review his handling of district contracts and financial matters. What they found was troubling. Kellerman had a pattern of accusing contractors of fraud when projects didn't go exactly as he wanted, using the threat of criminal prosecution to avoid paying bills or to extract discounts. Marcus Webb wasn't his first victim, just his most prominent one. Other contractors came forward with stories of intimidation and false accusations, painting a picture of a man who'd weaponized his position to bully people he saw as beneath him. The Wayne County District Attorney's Office began reviewing all cases where Kellerman had been a key witness, and they found at least 3 other contractors who'd been charged with fraud based primarily on his testimony. Those cases were now being re-examined. Officers Todd Jameson and Rick Peterman, the bailiffs who'd physically removed Dr. Mitchell from the courthouse, were suspended without pay and required to undergo extensive retraining on implicit bias and proper protocol. Their union initially fought the suspension, arguing they'd been following orders and hadn't known Dr. Mitchell was actually a judge. But the union's position became untenable when the full video footage emerged, showing Dr. Mitchell repeatedly identifying herself, showing her credentials, demanding that they verify her identity with Chief Judge Williams. The bailiffs had made a choice to ignore all of that, to trust the word of a prosecutor over the evidence in front of their own eyes. That choice had consequences. Officer Kyle Brennan, the security guard who'd first stopped Dr. Mitchell at the entrance, resigned quietly before he could be fired. In his resignation letter, he wrote that he'd been following orders from someone he trusted, but he acknowledged that he should have verified Dr. Mitchell's credentials instead of taking Dennis Crawford's word that she was a threat. 6 months after the dismissal of charges, Marcus Webb stood in a federal courthouse in downtown Detroit, flanked by his attorneys, watching a jury return with a verdict in his civil rights lawsuit against Wayne County. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching their decision, and when the foreman read the number aloud, gasps rippled through the courtroom. $2.3 million in damages. Compensation for lost income, destroyed reputation, emotional distress, and the 18 months of hell Marcus had endured because Dennis Crawford and Robert Kellerman had decided his life was expendable in their pursuit of career advancement and personal vendettas. Marcus stood perfectly still as the number washed over him, trying to comprehend what it meant. Financial security for his family. The ability to rebuild his construction company. Vindication that came with a price tag large enough to make headlines. When he walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, surrounded by cameras and supporters, he finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system could work when enough people decided to make it work. Dennis Crawford never made it to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights, he accepted a plea deal. 7 years in federal prison, disbarment, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. The man who dreamed of becoming district attorney, who'd seen himself as a champion of justice, would spend the next 7 years in the same prison system he'd helped populate with people like Marcus Webb. Robert Kellerman faced his own reckoning. Criminal charges were filed for filing false police reports and conspiracy to commit fraud. He pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 3 years, along with an order to pay restitution to Marcus Webb and 2 other contractors he'd falsely accused. The school board fired him immediately after his guilty plea, and his pension was reduced substantially as part of the settlement. The man who'd wielded his authority like a weapon discovered that authority could be taken away just as quickly as it had been granted. The Wayne County District Attorney's Office underwent a comprehensive review that revealed systematic problems in how cases were handled, how evidence was preserved, and how prosecutors were supervised. Thomas Brennan, the district attorney, announced he wouldn't seek re-election, acknowledging that corruption had flourished on his watch and that new leadership was needed to rebuild trust. The office implemented new protocols requiring multiple prosecutors to review all evidence in high-profile cases, created an independent oversight committee to investigate misconduct complaints, and established mandatory training on ethical obligations and implicit bias. It wasn't enough to fix everything that was broken, but it was a start. Officers Jameson and Peterman eventually returned to work after completing their retraining, but their reputations never fully recovered. They became cautionary tales within the courthouse, examples of what happened when you let bias override common sense, when you trusted the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Dr. Ayanna Mitchell became a national figure in the months following the incident, though she never sought that spotlight. The video of her being dragged from the courthouse had been viewed more than 50 million times across various platforms, sparking conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms about how black professionals were perceived and treated even when they held positions of authority. She gave a handful of carefully selected interviews, always bringing the focus back to Marcus Webb and to the systemic failures that had nearly destroyed his life. She spoke at law schools and judicial conferences about the importance of scrutinizing prosecutorial evidence, about the dangers of accepting narratives at face value, about the responsibility judges had to question authority when something didn't look right. She continued serving on the Michigan Court of Appeals, where her reputation for holding prosecutors and law enforcement accountable for misconduct only grew stronger. 6 months after Marcus Webb walked out of that courtroom a free man, Dr. Mitchell sat down for an interview with a journalist from the Detroit Free Press, the same publication whose reporter had captured the viral video. The journalist asked her how she made sense of what had happened, how she processed being physically removed from a courthouse while trying to do her job. Dr. Mitchell took a moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. "They saw a black woman and assumed I didn't belong there," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They never imagined I could be the judge. That failure of imagination, that assumption based on nothing but the color of my skin, is what allowed them to put their hands on me and drag me out of that building. But that's exactly why representation matters. That's why we need to keep fighting to be in these rooms, on these benches, making these decisions. Because justice shouldn't depend on who's holding the gavel. But sometimes, unfortunately, it does." The Marcus Webb case became required reading in criminal law and legal ethics courses across the country, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition overrides integrity, when prosecutors decide that winning matters more than truth. Law professors used it to teach students about Brady violations, about the duty to preserve exculpatory evidence, about the catastrophic consequences of prosecutorial misconduct. It was taught alongside cases about wrongful convictions and systemic racism in the criminal justice system, a modern example of how far the system still had to go. But it was also taught as a story of resilience, of one woman's refusal to accept injustice even when she was being physically removed from the building. Students watched the video of Dr. Mitchell being dragged through those courthouse doors, heard her voice echoing through the marble corridors insisting that a mistake was being made, and learned that sometimes justice required someone willing to stand firm even when everyone else said to back down. Marcus Webb rebuilt his construction company and made it a point to hire people who'd been through the criminal justice system, people who'd been accused or convicted and who struggled to find work because of their records. He understood what it meant to have your reputation destroyed, to be presumed guilty, to fight for a chance to prove your worth. His company thrived, winning contracts across Michigan, and he became an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at events about the need for accountability and oversight. And every year on the anniversary of the day his charges were dismissed, he sent flowers to Dr. Ayanna Mitchell's chambers with a note that simply read, "Thank you for seeing the truth."